Welcome to Curious Salma. My guest today is Mike Klein. Mike is a communication consultant and writer based in Reykjavik, Iceland. He founded the We Lead Comms campaign to recognize courage, initiative, and leadership in the communication professions. He's an MBA graduate of London Business School and the former chair of International Association of Business Communicators in Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. I've met Mike over a year ago through LinkedIn when he approached me to be a part of the We Lead Comms community. So I'm very happy that we're getting to finally meet and talk about communications in this episode. How are you, Mike?
I'm excellent. How are you?
I am exhausted. Not a good way to start the podcast, but like it's finally the weekend.
Well, my hope is that over the course of our conversation, you and your listeners will be a bit more energized about communication and about what they can do to make a difference in their parts.
Yeah, sure. Talking about communication always energizes me, plus, of course, coffee. First of all, I wanted to thank you as again because you were one of the people who always like share news about the podcast on the We Lead Comms community. I'm very grateful for that, and I want you to start by maybe telling people what is the We Lead Comms.
Wheatley comes is based on an idea that all of us who work in communication show some degree of initiative, show some degree of courage, and take steps to turn things from words into action. And so, what I wanted to do was really create a vehicle for really recognizing the contributions that a full range of professional communicators make, not just those with high titles, not just those in London, not just those in New York, but pretty much anybody who chooses a career in communication and does anything more than what they're directly told to do is has a leadership role in and of themselves. And I wanted to recognize that, to celebrate it, and to connect people in different geographies, different disciplines with each other.
I really like that actually because when I became part of the community, I found that you've featured and you've highlighted people from all sorts of the world actually, and again also not just senior people and their career but like also juniors, also mid-level professionals. So I think it's a very great way to feel connected, that we all have this sort of, I wouldn't say passion, but like we all have sort of interest in communications.
Well, we also all have impact as communicators, and I think that's really what we need to focus on. And the other side of it is that when you're working, particularly in a corporate role, particularly in internal communication, which is my specialty or my main specialty, I should say, a lot of communication pros are actually really isolated. They may be working remotely, or in most cases, when they're in house, it's very rare that they have somebody at peer level who understands their issues that they can talk to. And so, one of the opportunities that comes from Wheatley Comms is that I've created a list of about 400 people who work in this field. Somebody's going to add value to somebody else. And so, I strongly encourage, honorees and followers of Wheatley Comms. We got about 400 honorees and just over 4,600 followers, for people to connect directly with each other if they think they could be of interest or support.
So Mike, you just told me before recording, I didn't know that you're actually American and that you've worked in several places beside Iceland. So how did this come about? Why don't you tell me your journey?
After graduating from the University of Wisconsin in the late 80s, I've always had a major interest in politics and government. And I spent a year in New York State studying the mechanics of government. And I realized that the mechanics of government were not something I was really interested in. And so, for that point, for about the following 8 years, I managed political campaigns professionally all over the United States. It's a lot of fun. It's a lousy way to make a living. And by the end of that period, I was starting to think about business school. I'd also done some traveling in Europe. And what I realized was that in going to business school, I actually wanted to create a career for myself that would allow me to work internationally. And so that's why I chose London for business school. And that's why I've largely chosen to stay outside the US for most of my career. So I've worked in the UK, I've worked in Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and now Iceland. And I also have some US clients and a Canadian client as well. The Canadian client is a company called Sparrow Connected, which is a leading manufacturer or developer of internal communication software.
So when you said campaigning for working in with political campaigners, I kind of imagined all of these Hollywood movies, right? I think it must be a very hectic like job, work life balance wise.
There is no work-life balance. You work in politics because it is your life. It's because it's a, it's a higher commitment. It's a higher calling. It's 24/7 when you're doing it, and then there's nothing to do for weeks or months at a time until the next election surfaces. Or in my case, you go to wherever the next election is. If you follow the calendar in the United States, you'll find that aside from the main elections every 2 years, certain states and certain counties and certain cities have their elections on different schedules. And you, if you're willing to move, as I was at the time, I'd go from say North Carolina to Alabama to Louisiana, back to Maryland. But it was not really much of a life because I was effectively on tour most of the time, and I was married to my first wife at the time, and we kind of decided that Europe and business was probably a better use for my talents long.
Which country you say that you found you like the most, living in the most?
As an adult married person, I'd probably say Iceland because the quality of life here is good. It's cold and it's a little expensive, but for example, we have year-round outdoor swimming pools even when it's 10 below.
Wow.
The water's still 30, the water's still 44. And so long as you can get yourself in and out of the pool, it's actually a very pleasant experience. We also have some of the best nature, a lot of it's and Reykjavik's a really comfortable city. It's a city of about 200,000, and it's a setting that's very similar to the kind of place where I went to university. A small city with, basically it's like a college town with embassy,
Hmm.
and it's lovely. But the best place I've ever lived, where when I was just in general, is actually Brussels, which has a lousy reputation as a place to visit. But if you just scratch the surface a little bit, you find the restaurants, you find the cafes, you find the people who are interested in the stuff that you're interested in, and because Brussels is a truly international capital, you can find the kind of people you really enjoy spending time with, and so it's a very easy place to live if you're not Belgian. I used to joke that I would go weeks without seeing an actual Belgian living in Brussels.
Wow. Kind of similar to here.
Yeah, I imagine Dubai is quite similar.
Yeah, it's very cosmopolitan and expats are everywhere. On the positive side, it doesn't make me feel, like a foreigner that much because everyone here is just an expat basically.
Exactly. Same thing in Brussels. In Washington, it's similar if you're American because there are very few people who are actually from Washington, and it usually comes down to the choice of sports teams. They have a football team there, which are now called the Commanders. Used to be called the Redskins, and most of the people who live in Washington don't like the Redskins because they're not real Washington people. I'm a Bears fan myself, and that's just American football. I mean, my real loyalty is to Tottenham Hotspur Football Club in English football. If I ever get a tattoo, it'll be a tattoo of the Tottenham Hotspur crest, and it'll be the year they win Premier League championship.
Good to know. Good to know you're a fan of sports. I want to ask you, what are you curious about in general?
I'm curious about how groups of people interact with each other and how to change the ways that groups of people interact with each other. The book that I wrote back in 2011, which is called From Lincoln to LinkedIn, really focuses more on group and tribal dynamics in organizations and communities than on individual behavior. In the world of internal communication, there's a huge amount of emphasis on psychology, neuroscience, and a lot of drivers of individual behavior. And there's almost a studied contempt of political science and sociology. And a lot of it is because they want to boil things down to the lowest common denominator, and they'd like everybody to do exactly the same thing. Like, for example, employee engagement scores. Employee engagement scores are designed to try to measure how well you get at making people think the same way. And in the reality in organizations, people are different. You know, engineers are different from accountants, are different from HR people, are different from salespeople. And there are some people, for example, who are sales engineers. They are engineers who know how to sell, or salespeople who've learned about engineering. But their tribal loyalties are a bit more core. You know, there's a difference between the way people identify what they do versus the way they identify who they are. And who they are is ultimately what drives a lot of their behavior. It also drives the logic behind their behavior. And when you're cooking it down to the individual, you miss that richness, miss that logic, and most of all, you miss the power that's available from looking at people a little bit broadly as members of groups rather than just as individuals. So I'm really curious, and I've always been curious about how do we get a better understanding of tribal and group dynamics in organizations, communities, and societies, and how do we influence tribes of people and groups of people to behave more collaboratively instead of confrontatively.
It's very interesting when you said that employee engagement surveys are meant to measure how the percentage of how people think the same way.
Absolutely.
Because the way we used to deal with it is that we want to see how people are satisfied, how people are believe in the mission, believe. But now you just like said it bluntly, right? Like, do companies want really want employees to be thinking the same way, to be like all in the same frame, the same mindset? Or supposedly what companies broadcast as communicate is that we want people to be from different backgrounds, we want diversity, we want different thinking, but still they measure it with tools that says, okay, how what is the percentage of them thinking the same way? You know what I mean, the contradiction in that.
Employee engagement as a concept has been around for about 25 years. And most people think it's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with it. Everybody should support it. You know, everybody should want to be in the top quartile in employee engagement. Now, the challenge with employee engagement when it comes to either diversity of demographics or diversity of thought or diversity of action is that employee engagement surveys make no provision for any of that diversity. The employee engagement score is a single monolithic score which ultimately tries to norm behavior in a single direction. 20 years ago, the diversity conversation was we need to have more diverse people, but they've got to be total cultural fit. So, you know, you find black managers who like golf, for instance. You know, you find people people of color who thrived in white environments, you know, people who belong to white sororities in American colleges, for instance. You know, their HR had certain tricks to be able to game the color statistics while keeping the mindsets pretty fixed. One of the things that happened, though, is one of the problems when you try to crush diversity in organizations is that you also crush the ability of your organization to make intelligent decisions because everybody's thinking the same way, everybody's got the same view of things, and it's more about validation than deliberation. And today, there's a lot less tolerance for that. And also, there's an acceptance of the fact that a lot of the messes that we've made as society with a big S, are because we took the same assumptions on board and we just kept moving in the same direction. You know, the idea that, you know, solar and wind only works when the weather's good or weather's bad. You know, it's like, you know, there was just a lot of things that were taken off the table because they didn't make sense within the very narrow logic in which decision makers were operating.
So you mentioned that your main specialty is internal comms.
Correct.
I've worked first in communications and then delved into internal comms gradually. And to be very honest with you, at the beginning I didn't like it at all. I was like, internal comms doesn't have the same glamour. It's not, it's not meeting with media. It's just you're talking to employees, and who most likely don't care about what the company posts. So in the beginning I was like opposed to like taking this project, right? But what happened to me is we took it during the beginning of the pandemic. It became suddenly all the companies, I think you would have, of course, a lot of say in that. That since the pandemic, all the companies suddenly thought, oh, internal comms is very important. We need to keep people updated with what's happening. We need to keep them engaged, especially when the remote work now is more and more adapted. So I want to get your take on, does internal comms have the same glamour and the same importance as, talking to media, talking to government, talking like all of the different things that you also have done in the past and the present?
Less glamour, more importance. It's not glamorous. Working with employees is not glamorous. You're talking about a bunch of issues which often you can't even talk about outside the firewall because you're under NDA, they're confidential, or at the very least, they seem really terrestrial, really transactional, really granular. But there's a lot of dynamics underneath. I mean, internal communication is really political communication within a corporate context. Just as you know, public relations is much more about managing the for lack of a better term, the communities around the product, around the organization, the external stakeholders. The internal stakeholders actually care a hell of a lot more about what's going on inside the company, why things are happening inside the company, and where things are going inside the company. And they also have a lot more at stake. You know, when you buy cornflakes from Kellogg's, your relationship is about where you're getting the cornflakes from. When you are working for an organization, you're getting your salary, you're getting your mortgage, you're getting your job security, you're getting your social prestige, and you're getting a good chunk of your personal relationships from inside that company. And those differences of opinion about, you know, whether we're going to be Pantone 396 or 397, the context behind them could actually be much more interesting than just a couple of color codes. It can be, is it marketing making the decisions? Is it operations making the decisions? The politics are actually far more intricate. They're also far less visible. And being a really solid internal comms person isn't about doing graphics and getting posters up. It's about understanding those dynamics and making sure that the organization's best interests are served and moved forward by managing the tension between those interests. And another side of it is that when you're in internal communication, particularly in a central internal comms role, you share the 360 degree perspective that your organization's leadership should share. So that puts you in a position to start to have credible conversations with your most senior leaders. Now you've got to have data to back it up, but I teach a course on how to find that data, and it's actually not hard to find data that can be persuasive to leadership. There's a great quote that says, just as much fiction has been written in Excel has been written in Word. There's this belief among communication folk that their numbers aren't good, their numbers aren't real. But finance numbers come on stone tablets. No, finance makes up their numbers even more than, at least we have to go out and collect the data. They can make the data up themselves, they can extrapolate it and justify their extrapolations. This is a lot, their data is no more quantitative than ours.
Wow.
Communications people are so intimidated by the hard functions in the business. And we
Yeah.
need to get over that because that's the biggest thing that holds us back collectively as a species.
I don't think intimidated, but think they have to do as much more effort to prove, as you said, that their priorities and their business priorities are as important as other functions, right?
Right, but we can also throw it back in everybody's faces too. Because I mean, one of the things that I teach on my measurement master class is something called the two-question survey. And in those two questions that I ask, what are the top three priorities facing your organization, and what are the three most important things you're working on? What happens is that the C level says, okay, these are the top priorities, and then they expect that the whole organization is working to that playbook consciously. And the reality is, people are working to their own playbooks, or they're working to their own managers' playbooks. You ask this question, you get this on paper, and you can come back and say, well, actually, 60% of your people think that these two priorities, which even aren't on your list, are the top two most important priorities in your organization. Once you have that on paper, once you have that data, then you're capable of having a completely different conversation between a leader talking from their own intuition and you as a less senior person talking from your intuition. The moment you bring data into the conversation, it transforms the conversation, and it's actually very easy to collect this data.
When you say easy to collect this data, do you mean using tools or stuff? Because some data, yani, for me, working in internal comms, again, what I liked is that, as you said, you work with the leadership and all, but you also work with different stakeholders within the company, different functions,
Sure, absolutely.
and you have to talk with each of these functions and get some data with them in order to do a consolidated, plan and say, okay, that's
Absolutely.
so. When you say it's easy, I feel like maybe the challenge could be sometimes if some units are not willing to cooperate, or if their way of collecting this data is not, that organized, so that could present a
Well,
difficulty.
that's if you're at the mercy of their data. I mean, the thing that I teach about in the measurement masterclass, I teach three basic things. One is how to analyze the data. Second is how to collect the data. And third is how do you choose what data you want to collect? Because as a communication person, you know, once you start working with data, you will find that certain questions and certain measures will demonstrate a clear relationship between what you do in communication and the actual actions people take in your organization.
Hmm.
And once you can draw a straight line to that, then all of the fake measurements, like employee engagement surveys, and I will call it a fake measurement in terms of being able to measure a relationship between employee engagement and actual organizational performance, there's a correlation, but they've never, that even Gallup, the pinnacle of employee engagement, has never determined a causal relationship
Hmm.
between the two. If you are introducing words and phrases into the organization and an increasing number of people are using those words and phrases, that's a causative relationship, not a correlation.
Hmm.
And that takes you into another space.
Interesting. What is the most important lesson you've learned over your career?
The most important lesson I've learned over my career is to look both ways when you cross the street, because otherwise you might get hit by a bus. I mean, in reality, I'm joking, but I'm not joking because you it's so easy to get focused on where you're going and what you want to do that you completely lose contact with the stakeholders and the communities and the tribes that you're actually trying to engage. So you really need to have a good idea of what's going on before you take your own action. The second biggest lesson, I like to answer questions in threes. The second biggest lesson I've learned is don't victimize yourself for your mistakes. Because I've made some big mistakes in my career, particularly my political career, where I thought things were well known when in fact they were confidential or had to be treated with more security. That was, learning that stuff that I learned the hard way. Cybersecurity is no joke. Confidentiality is no joke. And, that's something that I've learned over time, but boy, the early lessons were brutal. The third thing that's most important is don't stay somewhere where you are having to do gymnastics to fit in the organ. I like to joke that one of the roles that I had, it was for 6 months, and it was the longest 6 months of my life. I mean, don't stay any longer.
I love that. I really love that. Like, considering that my career is not as long as yours, but I still relate to a lot of what you said. What is one piece of advice you'd give to someone starting out in your career?
I think the biggest piece of advice I'd give is you've gotta if there's a piece of skills advice, interviewing is probably the most important skill you could have as a communication professional. More than data analysis, more than having a good personality, more than being organized. Because if you're not asking good questions, you're not moving the conversation forward. And you're not really adding value. Basically, if you're not asking good questions, you're a secretary or a graphic artist who happens to be assembling stories. The key thing with good questions is that you can be influential with good questions a lot earlier in your career than you can be with good answers. When you're 22, no one's coming to you for answers. But if you're coming at them with questions, you're requiring them to step outside of their own preset answers and actually move their own conversations forward. So the quickest ticket to influence, particularly as a junior person, is to get really good at asking questions.
How are my questions so far?
They're good.
I thought when you said when you're 22 and no one's asking you questions, that's kind of a good segue to the digital world and its intersection with public relations and communications. Because, my background, most of it was social media marketing, and I got into it by chance, not by, determination. I studied journalism, wanted to become a journalist. I worked in social media when things were still exciting, evolving, more organic, less, automated, less ads. But PR and comms, I'm telling you all of this from my perspective.
Sure.
It felt for the longest period traditional. It felt like corporate like. And then when they started to adapt to digital, I felt like now it became a good environment for me to come and try out things, because I felt like, yeah, now they want the people who are molded into the digital world, or and who can, give them the answers that they need. So my point is, I think no matter how old you are or in your seniority, there is a kind of industry or a kind of field that you would know more than the oldest person, the more senior person, right? And for me, I started enjoying PR and comms more when it evolved to include much more digital.
Well, I'm from the borders of Gen X. I'm Gen X by luck more than by origin. But I think there's a mix. Younger people have developed much more native agility with social media. This does not mean that you've got to be under 40 to know social media, because that's utter bullshit.
Of course.
You've got people, for example, like me. I've been in digital just as long as any digital native. Yes, I came from from the baggage of having lived before internet. And one of the projects that I'm doing right now, I'm the communication lead for a digital campaign called Accountability Fish, which is looking to bring accountability to the world of international fisheries management. And this is a 21st century digital campaign. And I have 20th century pre digital political campaign experience. So I'm having to learn a lot quickly. And obviously, I'm relying on people who are much more agile in this than I am. But in terms of political strategy, I've got 30 years of experience with political strategy, and political strategy experience is cumulative and additive. The more
Hmm.
campaigns you see, the more scenarios you see, the more you're able to distill. And so I think the good news is that the generation gap in organizations is closing, but this idea that every employee needs to have 7 years of experience is horsepucky. Um,
I've
you
never
know,
heard that word in my life, by the way.
it's a good Midwestern version of you know what. But there's a huge amount of ageism in the workforce, particularly in the communication professions, particularly in terms of HR people screening for age.
Hmm.
And to be honest, I've answered a few job applications over the years. If some these days, if somebody that wants to find out where when I went to college, when I went to university, screw them. It's none of their business. They can figure it out if they interview me. But the other side of it is, in that context, it's like, okay, what is it that you're trying to do as an organization? If you're trying solely to reach Gen Z, you need a lot of Gen Z's folks, because you need to understand their voice, their hopes, their aspirations. On the other hand, if you think that you can get by with hiring a 24-year-old strategist to navigate the kind of strategic complexity that you're dealing with in the world, you've got another thing coming.
Hmm. Considering ageism, or a lot of the youth people that feel worried, feel anxious about where they are in their career, right? So for instance, if I'm like 29 and I'm not like a manager at this point, then I am kind of late, I'm behind. I've heard this. I've met people who feels this need, and I used to think like, oh, they are harsh on themselves, but the reality is the market as well is getting harsher by every year, right? So what do you think? How do you define success in your career?
Okay, can I break that apart into a couple of questions? Because
Sure.
those are okay. I think the first issue is: are you finished at the age of 29 if you don't have a couple of bars on your shoulder, you don't have a corner office? And the answer is no. The answer is absolutely no. But it may mean that you may need to go and step back and get different kinds of experience. If you're trying to get a linear career where your salary increases, on a linear basis over time, that may be difficult because further in your career, you're more likely to be hired for the stuff that people think you're good at rather than the stuff that you want people to think you want to do. And so you've got to be willing to zigzag a little bit, pick up skills, pick up experience. You know, it's hard to move up in status in a single organization, even though that was the model. Because the problem is people see you as A when you want people to see you as A plus one. And until you can convince them that you're A plus one when they see you every day,
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to see you as A plus one. It's much easier to put out a resume that says I'm A plus one and get somebody to interview you for an A plus one job. So I think staying in the same company is a crazy idea unless you really love that company and everything that it does. Staying there for the sake of career advancement, it worked in the 50s, it worked in the 70s, it does not work now. Now, how do you define success? I mean, I struggle with this because I'm an entrepreneur. I have to go out and get my own business. And I see people with less experience and less strategic nous making far more money in corporate jobs than I make. And so, am I less of a success? Well, financially, I am. But on the other hand, I have much more of an opportunity to make impact in my role than in some corporate role when I'm basically forbidden from talking to the public. I'll make more difference in this conversation if 100 people listen to it than I'm going to make in sending out some anodyne announcement about some executive moving from one job to another inside the company. So that's part of it. But I mean, I consciously try to make a difference by doing stuff that other people are not doing, particularly in this industry. So that's why I set up Wheelie Comms, because we had an issue in this industry where you had, probably 100 different associations, none of which talked to each other. And a half dozen of them were claiming to speak for the industry. And so what I did with Wheelie Comes is I started profiling people who belong to the different organizations. And nobody speaks for the industry unless we all speak for the industry. So that's one way in which I've been trying to make a difference. The second is that I'm a huge believer in qualitative research as being an accelerator of collective performance because you can surface the issues that people aren't really talking about, and then you can move towards resolving those issues. And so, not only do I sell that in terms of the courses and consultancy that I do, but I also created something called the Communication Leaders Survey, which has just come out in the last couple of days, where I sent out a questionnaire to 100. I sent it out to thousands of people. 155 people actually decided to complete the questionnaire, covering 30 different countries, and we addressed the questions: or what are the biggest issues facing the industry? What are the biggest issues facing in people? Facing people in doing their jobs. What are the biggest topics of conversation? And what would they love to get rid of if they had a magic wand? And we distilled that into some actionable buckets. And what we realize is that most communication people are more concerned about stuff that's inside their firewall and how they're seen than about the difference that they can make on bigger issues. Only 4% of people that I talked to or that responded said that climate was an opportunity. 4%. We're communication leaders. We are people. Like here in Iceland, we've got these companies building these factories where they take carbon out of the air and they turn it into rock, spending tens, hundreds of $1 million to do that.
I've heard of that. That's amazing.
Yeah, but communication people moving in the right direction can take a hell of a lot more CO2 out of the air by educating people about the right behaviors, but also helping organizations decarbonize and change their fuel patterns and change their organizational processes. If we do that, we won't need those damn factories.
Well, I feel like looking positively at things that there is a desire from all of these corporates now, at least to, and look like they care and do more and provide their ESG. So at least, if you look like 10 years ago, this was not even on the map.
No, that's right. And this is the point of critical opportunity for the communications profession. Communication profession, particularly internal communicators, have been chasing their tail when it comes to demonstrating the value of their work. And it's been hard to do that in dollar terms. In carbon terms, it's a hell of a lot easier. And now we can translate carbon terms to dollar terms. And the UN says that it's going to cost $3 trillion to decarbonize. If we could get 10 million of that into IABC and refocus IABC on supporting and training folks with decarbonization as the agenda, it's not just to solely focus on decarbonization. No, but it's like in the world of sports to have one game that we all play together, which is the decarbonization game. Then we can all go up play our other games and use the lessons that we play, that we learn in the decarbonization comms process. That could be a revolution for our profession. It can also provide the career security and the remuneration that we deserve, but have been found it very difficult to justify. This is a profound moment of opportunity, but we have to recognize it, we have to seize it, and we have to challenge those who question whether we're going in the right direction.
Such you're very inspirational. Like I feel you're very passionate about the cause. I want to get off the couch and do something right now. But still, I'm really tired. It's the weekend.
Understand?
But I love seeing that. And I want to ask you something outside the communication for a bit.
Sure.
What's the best compliment you've ever received?
Couple of really good ones. One's a communication one. I was working for EasyJet Airlines back in the day, back when they merged with Go Airlines around the turn of the century. And I was ghostwriting for a lot of the C level folks. And I drafted this, really solid, controversial op ed for the chief operating officer. And I sent it to him, and he didn't even bother to read it. He said, "Mike, you're good. I trust you." Now
Nice.
that was good. I think another one is that somebody said if you didn't exist, we'd have to create you.
Wow. I love that. If you could go back and give your 18-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Spend less money.
What's one question that you wish I had asked you and how you would have answered?
Why should people come visit Iceland?
Honestly, I would love to hear that because as I told you in the beginning before recording, I don't know much about Iceland other than the beautiful scenery. But yeah, why should people come to Iceland?
Well, a few things. First of all, my wife has an Iceland travel business called Iceland Unwrapped, and we actually work on it together. I do a fair amount of the marketing, writing, the blogging. As my wife says, having a native English editor in the house is certainly a competitive advantage. Part of it is that Iceland is a genuinely different place. I mean, one of the things that really drove me, particularly to move to Europe, was I had lived in 13 different states in the US, and I had pretty much done it all. And then I moved to Europe, lived in a bunch of different countries, and at a certain level, you were getting to a certain level of sameness. You don't get to that level of sameness in Iceland. It's different. It's different every season. It's different every place. Even Reykjavik, even though it's a town of 200,000 people, it's always changing. You've got, Iceland admits its share of refugees, which means that we've always got new types of ethnic restaurants. First it was Thai, then it was Vietnamese. Now there are great Syrian places over time. There is a certain vibrancy to the culture here that's that you don't necessarily come looking to Iceland for ethnic food, but
Yeah.
but we've got that. We've also got a relaxed atmosphere. It's a very egalitarian society, and you have celebrities who will come here and spend months at a time. Like Jodie Foster's been here for a year, and there's no one who hassles her.
Mm,
It used to be that celebrities had to live in New York to avoid being hassled, just simply because by the time you got recognized, you were a half block down and there were 300 people between.
yeah.
But the culture here, it's not perfect by any means, but there are things that are really recommended, including The both the respect that people have for each other and their willingness to leave, to leave people alone who don't want to be hassled. The other side of it is that um, it's just you drive in Iceland, the scenery changes every 5 minutes, and the scenery is completely different going down the same road in the opposite direction.
Wow.
The quality. I mean, you can literally go around the country clockwise and counterclockwise and have almost a completely different experience of it. And there's nowhere else in the world that's like that.
Wow, I want to visit now if I could.
Good. IcelandUnwrapped.com.
One question I just remembered now that I wanted to ask you before we wrap up is I feel in the communication industry, people are really prone to burnout. I don't know if you'd agree or not, but they are always taking on a lot of different things. As you said, they are dealing with different stakeholders. They should be always on alert. Their job is dynamic and keeps expanding. So, what would you advise to avoid burnout or to like just be conscious and prepared?
Well, I had an episode like that when I was in a big corporate after a change of boss, and it was difficult. And part of it is that you know the extent to which you feel that you have autonomy, that you have some say in what you're doing, is absolutely critical. And even if it's just simply within a range, if that range goes out of balance, that can be a real warning sign. That could be a sign that you do need to start making steps to leave, because you've got three factors there. You've got your expectations, and then the other person's expectations, and you're trying to triangulate that relationship. The less of a gap between those 3 points, the happier you're gonna be. Now, the other side of it is that we in communications are spending a lot of time talking about our own well-being. There have been a couple of surveys done, and I'm glad that people are doing this stuff, but we can't have this just be about us. You know, we as communication professionals have a unique space in organizations. We actually turn people's ideas into reality. We need to accept our responsibility, both in terms of that being the magnitude of what we do and also the calling that we have. And so, yes, we need to take care of ourselves. Self care is not negotiable on one hand. But on the other hand, we can't allow ourselves to be so self centered as to lose the focus on what we're here to do.
Yeah, so as the well-being of everyone else.
Well, not just the well being of everyone else, organizations have to perform. Organizations have to deliver for their stakeholders, or they have to renegotiate their expectations with their stakeholders. Now, the challenge is if you've got an organization that's promising something that it's not delivering, and your organization is tasking you with maintaining that gap, they're putting you in a well being problem. And by all means, call it out and start getting your resume around if that's what the situation is.
Mike, where can listeners find you online?
My favorite place is my LinkedIn profile. Type in MKLEIN818 and you'll find me. I'm also on Twitter. My business one is Changing Term, CHANGINGTERMS. And We Lead Comms, hashtag We Lead Comms.
Mike, I can't thank you enough. I didn't expect to have like a master class in communications today, to be honest. You've given me a lot of actual, tangible things to work on or to think about. So I'm very thankful for this discussion today.
Well, I'm grateful for the chance to speak with your audience. I really appreciate that. And I'm grateful for your leadership and that which you show as a communication leader every day of the week.
Thank you very much, Mike.
You're very welcome.